I'm Bonnie Silvestri, and I'm here as part of our Office of Community Engagement and Partnerships Conversation Series, and I'm so delighted to be joined by Dr. Corey Dolgon, who was our guest speaker this morning for our Service Learning Day, our annual Service Learning Day, but this was by far our most exciting of all, and he gave a fantastic talk this morning called Truthiness, Junk Science, and Conventional Wisdom. So I wanted to dig a little deeper into the conversation that we had this morning and share it with all of you. So we started, thank you by the way for everything you've done for us, we really appreciate it. We started with watching Stephen Colbert and his discussion of truthiness, which I really enjoyed, sort of taking that trip down memory lane and sort of thinking about Supreme Court nominations at this time when it's so significant. So I thought maybe you could tell us a bit about why you chose to start with truthiness and how that's really impacting our academic environment.
Sure. For me, truthiness represents the way in which we have come to embrace knowledge that isn't necessarily based on research or intellect or scholarship, but based on whether or not it makes us feel good.
Yes.
And so one of the issues that I think academics don't necessarily want to face is that the very product that they're putting out there, which we assume is the best research that they can do, that then might impact policy making, health, all the different sectors that people produce knowledge for, has been degraded. That the idea of doing research to produce knowledge that can do good things for people has been degraded to the point that by politicizing knowledge in a way that discredits it, we've become a country that looks to someone like Donald Trump, who really isn't offering us anything except making us feel better, or making us feel better about being angry about the way things are. And there isn't any substance, and I think that that's become the norm in politics, but it certainly degrades what we do on campus, and I think changes the kind of institutional life we have when the impact of our work has been so effective.
How did we get to this place of truthiness? What you talked a bit about sort of the history and what's happened in the academic world, but sort of how did this happen?
Well, read my new book.
Okay.
I do have a new book coming out this fall, and so far it's titled Kill It to Save It, How American Common Sense is Killing Us. It may be titled something differently as the publishers come up with something more marketable, which is kind of funny to say, but in fact that is part of the issue, right, is the marketization and commodification of everything, right? So part of the argument in the book, which has to do as a lead up to truthiness, is that my argument is that essentially it was post-Vietnam and the rise of Ronald Reagan and his administration that essentially found that political and economic gain could be had by quote-unquote dumbing down the public. Right? And that in fact you could use these myths of freedom and individualism as I wouldn't say as a ruse, but as a real deeply ingrained ideological myth about who Americans are. And so I argue that the combination of hyper-individualism, which Robert Bellah wrote about years and years ago, with corporate hegemony, with the domination of corporations and politics, have created this kind of toxic blend in which we no longer really look to research for facts. In fact, we don't want facts, we want truthiness. We look to the people who will tell us that it's all these other people who are to blame for your problems, and all you need is to be free of them, like public spending on public programs. Essentially people are always against those programs and the spending on them if they don't benefit from them, right? So we've created a public sector based on individualism and the idea that we can have a checklist of what we want. And now I'd say the mantra is hands off my Medicare, government hands off my Medicare, right? The idea that in some ways you don't want government doing public programs unless they benefit you.
Absolutely, and the metaphorical bootstraps and the number of times that we hear about pulling yourself up from your bootstraps is infuriating because there's so much institutional dysfunction that has led to people becoming
No, that's right, and I would say over the last 35 years, it's gotten to the point of farce. And your own senator from the state, Marco Rubio, I write about towards the end of the book, because I think he's the perfect person to represent what the public sector succeeded in producing, right? That public education, right? That public programs, that a whole host of what we created to make the country a place that people could work hard to get ahead. His policies actually are about dismantling them, right? And so the idea of touting, in fact, in one of his first speeches, he touted Medicare for what it had done for his parents, right? But now promotes policies that would privatize Medicare. So there's this constant conflict between what people say that we're about and then what policies we actually create. And ultimately, for the field of civic engagement, I think it's a real challenge to not only do civic engagement well, which I think we're actually doing a great job of, but do something that's really impactful in the world around campuses.
Yes, it's sort of like we're in this a little bit of an infancy with regard to civic engagement and community engagement, and that it really, in order to have the impact that we want it to have, I keep thinking about our regional meetings at Florida Campus Compact. So we meet in little groups and we talk about what's happening on our campus, but what if we all really came together and started to say, these are things that need to happen for the state or the country, and the way we could all come together, I think, would be ideal. Would you think that's sort of the next step?
Absolutely. And infancy is an optimistic word in the sense that we would grow and develop. I'm not always as optimistic, but I do think that the metaphor is worthwhile because I do think it can be optimistic. We can build the kind of civic engagement, service learning, community-based research that we want if we're willing to make that commitment. And I think that's where the real struggle within institutions like universities come about, because faculty and institutions as a whole are not hardwired to be community engaged and civic engaged. And I think we do, there's almost like a truth and reconciliation thing that we have to do. Colleges and universities, especially private ones, but certainly big public institutions as well, don't like to think about where they came from. We have to recognize that we still promote stratification. In fact, we recruit students based on saying, you will do better, you'll have a better career, you'll make more money, this will be your individual ticket to success. And I think that as long as we promote that as our primary function, I'd say we're kind of just propagating the idea that these are institutions for the elite. And these are institutions that train those who will work for the elite in those middle, managerial functions. But the question is, will we produce knowledge that might actually challenge that system of inequality and suggest we need to rethink the structure of our society to make it better for everyone?
Fantastic. There's so much to think about here. I just saw a play, and it was so dated. It was really well done. It's called All Wilderness, and it was a Eugene O'Neill play, and it's sort of this idealized world. And at the very end, the punishment for this kid was that he was going to have to attend Yale and go off to college. And it was funny because I was sort of watching this sort of all-white cast and thinking about, what does this say about this is the America that people are wanting us to return to, really. And it just had, and it was a commentary, but it had that feeling of so much elitism that I hope we can move forward, but I don't know to what extent.
Yeah, I think that we shall see which direction service learning and civic engagement takes, but I think much of that direction will be influenced by the politics around it. And so, the idea that we have created a government system, a political system that is clearly bought and sold, right? And I'll certainly admit to being more of a fan of Bernie Sanders than any of the other candidates although I'm so far left, I would say any vote for the Democratic Party is not a revolutionary act.
Mm-hmm.
But, to see him kind of stand up and say, do you think we're dumb? Do you think that we don't recognize that major corporations and foundations and individuals giving lots and lots of money, that we don't see that as polluting the political system, polluting our government, that we don't see them giving money for something in return? And, I think that message has been underlying for decades now, and we've never really talked about it. And I think we really have to get past even just the slogan, money in politics, to recognize what are the actual policies that some of the most rich and powerful people in this country have helped enact that have degraded the rest of us. And taxes are one of the most important, right? The idea that by cutting taxes on the wealthy by billions and billions and cutting taxes on some people in the middle class by 100, has degraded our public infrastructure, everything from schools to roads and bridges. And people complain about potholes all the time, but it's not as if as individuals we could fix them. We require the state, we require the local government to fix potholes because individuals cannot buy enough cement
Right.
to fix those potholes. Of course, they would probably say, well, it's only the potholes that I go over.
So what do you think is our next step? You were saying USF is sort of poised. You enjoyed a lot of the presentations that you
Yeah,
heard.
some great stuff.
Yes, and we were named most engaged for the state of Florida.
Mm-hmm.
But we have work to still be done.
Sure.
So what do you think you would recommend now that you've spent some time with us?
Yeah. Two things, and I think one's probably easier than the other. But I think you have all the players, all the faculty, you have the partnerships, you have some of the resources, but certainly the infrastructure, administratively and across campus. I think that some way to bring people together into building the relationships with the community institutionally. So different faculty, different people will have different relationships with different organizations. I think that being able to have an overarching, you have a center, but some kind of overarching thing to, I was talking about science shops this morning, to be able to open up in a way that you have the resources to match faculty with problems, but to bring people together in a way that it communicates across partnerships. So when partners come together, this is a place they come together and find out what other people are doing. And so that there's a community, there's a communication outward, not just among faculty, but also outward to the community. And people in the community not only know what's happening here at the university, but how they might partner with someone else in the community whose work they learned about through the work that your center would be doing here. So I think the science shop, there are a couple of different models around the international. Barcelona has some really interesting, fascinating stuff happening. Ireland has a lot of fascinating stuff. And to really think about how you can do some of that work outward more. The second thing, which is the harder thing, is the kind of do no harm adage, right? Which is to make sure that the university itself is not engaging in activities that are actually detrimental to the community. And I think a lot of universities in this day and age are seeing communities around them as partners, but often partners in development projects that are not necessarily beneficial to communities. They're beneficial to the colleges and to a political or economic elite. And so, to also be the kind of partner with a community that has the wherewithal and the commitment, right, and the courage to say, this is not the kind of project we should be a part of. And recognize that if in fact there are disadvantages to doing that politically or instrumentally or institutionally, that sometimes we have to pay the price when we're in search of justice.
Fantastic. You put that so beautifully. There was at a Florida Campus Compact event that I went to this past week, there was a whole discussion about maybe we do have to, we are in a particular power position, and community partners are afraid to necessarily say this isn't really going to work for me. And so we need to realize that there is this power differential, and to make sure that their voices really are heard in
Absolutely.
a very clear way.
No, absolutely. And I think people forget, there's actually some credential for the community partners to be working with the university. And it looks good for them on grant applications and other places. So a lot of times even the community won't be critical of the partnership because they don't want to lose that. But the truth is, if a university is part and parcel of a gentrification movement that's harming the local people in a community, that's going to cause more problems in that community than you could ever fix with good service learning projects. So sometimes, in fact, and I've been a part of this in other places, sometimes, in fact, getting students involved to make sure that their own university doesn't do detrimental things in the community can be a service learning project more important than any, activity at homeless shelters or food pantries or soup kitchens.
I think that is such a great point because as the anchor institution here, we have a responsibility and we need to really evaluate where's the money in the pensions, what food are we buying on campus?
That's right.
Things of that nature. That it would be great because a lot of students don't necessarily have vehicles to be able to get out into the community, but this is a really important community.
Well, it is, and again, it's another kind of failing in some ways of the civic engagement movement, and it reminds me of a semi-funny story on campus where we're now developing these extracurricular transcripts, and people from the research office wanted to know how we were designating the courses. And I was saying, well, actually, we're just starting the designation. I'm not crazy about designations in and of themselves. It helps us count, but it doesn't necessarily mean the work's better. And I said, well, we consider students who are doing, work on campus sometimes meeting civic engagement. And she said, well, how can that be? If they're not going out into the community, how can it be civic engagement? And I said, well, it's a false dichotomy. Mm-hmm. We are part of our community, right? And so if we're not doing a good job of recycling on campus, we're adding to their local and regional landfill and solid waste. If we're not doing a good job of, mentoring and tutoring in our community, if we're not also doing stuff on campus that encourages people to go to do Big Brother and Big Sister, for instance, running those programs is just as important as being out there. So there are a lot of things on campus that students do, and civic engagement has actually sometimes, I think, reified the line between campus and community as something we do outward, as opposed to recognizing the mutuality of what we do in a community.
Well, you have given us so much food for thought, and there's so much we can continue to unpack, so I'm really glad that you were here and you were able to do this conversation with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.